Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of flying, but she never imagined her career would lead her to this moment. Standing on the rain-soaked tarmac of the Coast Guard station in Alaska, she watched the dark clouds rolling in from the Pacific Ocean like an enormous gray blanket threatening to swallow everything in its path. The wind was already picking up, sending sheets of rain across the runway and making the helicopter blades creak ominously in their resting position. At 28 years old, Sarah had logged over 800 hours of flight time, but most of it had been in perfect weather conditions during training exercises. She was still considered a junior pilot by Coast Guard standards, which meant she usually flew with more experienced officers on routine missions. Today was supposed to be different. Today was supposed to be her first solo rescue mission. The call had come in 30 minutes earlier. A fishing vessel called the Northern Star was taking on water approximately 60 miles offshore. The boat had 7 crew members aboard, and, according to the last radio transmission, their engine had failed, and they were drifting dangerously close to a rocky outcrop, known locally as Devil's Teeth. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, and time was running out. Captain Robert Hayes, the station commander, approached Sarah with a grim expression. He was a man in his 50s who had seen more storms and rescued more people than anyone else at the base. His weathered face and silver hair spoke of decades spent battling the unforgiving Alaskan waters. When he looked at Sarah, she could see the conflict in his eyes. "Martinez, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice barely audible over the increasing wind. They walked into the operations center, where radar screens showed the massive storm system approaching their position. The meteorologist on duty was shaking his head as he pointed to the swirling mass of red and orange colors on the display. "This is going to be a Category 2 storm within the hour," the meteorologist explained. "Wind speeds are already at 45 knots and climbing. We're looking at gusts up to 70 knots, heavy rain, and near-zero visibility." Captain Hayes turned to Sarah. "Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't even consider sending anyone out in these conditions. But we have 7 lives at stake, and you're the only pilot available right now. Johnson is in the hospital with appendicitis, and Rodriguez is stuck in Anchorage due to mechanical problems with his aircraft." Sarah felt her heart racing. This was exactly the kind of mission she had trained for, but the timing couldn't be worse. She had been preparing for solo flights in good weather, not navigating through what was shaping up to be one of the worst storms of the season. "I understand the situation, sir," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's the current status of the Northern Star?" "Last contact was 15 minutes ago. They reported taking on water faster than their pumps could handle. The captain estimated they had maybe 2 hours before they'd have to abandon ship. That gives us a very narrow window." Sarah nodded, but she could see the doubt in Captain Hayes' eyes. He had been doing this job long enough to know when conditions were borderline impossible. The fact that he was even considering sending a junior pilot into this storm spoke to how desperate the situation had become. "Martinez," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder, "I'm going to be completely honest with you. You're not ready for this. No pilot with your level of experience should be taking on a mission like this. The conditions out there are going to test every skill you have, and probably a few you don't know you have yet." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had spent years working toward this moment, proving herself capable and reliable. To hear her commanding officer tell her she wasn't ready felt like having her dreams crushed in an instant. "But," Captain Hayes continued, "we don't have any other choice. Those fishermen are counting on us, and you're the only option we have. If you don't feel confident about this mission, I need you to tell me now. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations." Sarah looked out the window at the helicopter sitting on the tarmac. The HH-60 Jayhawk was a powerful machine, designed specifically for search and rescue operations in harsh conditions. She had flown this particular aircraft dozens of times during training, knew every gauge and control by heart. But she had never taken it into anything approaching these weather conditions. The thought of 7 people struggling to survive on a sinking boat made her decision for her. She couldn't let fear or self-doubt prevent her from at least trying to help them. If she succeeded, she would save 7 lives. If she failed, at least she would know she had given everything she had. "I'll take the mission, sir," she said, looking Captain Hayes directly in the eye. "I know the risks, and I know I'm not as experienced as I'd like to be, but I also know that those fishermen deserve a chance. Captain Hayes studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, Martinez, but I want you to understand something. This isn't about proving yourself or showing how brave you are. This is about making smart decisions and bringing everyone home safely, including yourself. If the conditions become too dangerous, you abort the mission. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Completely clear. Good. Let's get you briefed and in the air. We're losing daylight, and the storm isn't going to wait for us. The next 20 minutes were a whirlwind of preparation. Sarah reviewed the weather reports, studied the location of the Northern Star, and went through her pre-flight checklist twice. The rescue swimmer, Petty Officer James Park, would be accompanying her. He was an experienced operator who had performed dozens of water rescues, and his presence provided some comfort. As Sarah walked toward the helicopter, the wind was now strong enough to require her to lean into it to maintain her balance. Rain was falling in heavy drops that felt like small stones hitting her flight helmet. The ground crew was securing everything that could potentially become projectiles in the increasing wind. She performed her external inspection of the aircraft, checking every surface and component despite the worsening conditions. The helicopter looked solid and ready, but she knew that once they lifted off, they would be entering a world where the rules of normal flight no longer applied. Climbing into the pilot's seat, Sarah ran through her startup procedures. The familiar routine of switches and checks helped calm her nerves. The engine spooled up with its characteristic whine, and the rotor blades began their slow rotation. Through the cockpit windows, she could see Captain Hayes and the ground crew watching her intently. The radio crackled to life. Coast Guard Rescue 6021, this is base operations. You are cleared for takeoff. Current weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Wind is gusting to 55 knots from the southwest. Visibility is down to 2 miles and decreasing. Be advised, we may lose radio contact once you're more than 30 miles offshore. Sarah keyed her microphone. Base operations, Rescue 6021 copies all. Departing for Northern Star location. We'll maintain radio contact as long as possible. As she pulled up on the collective and felt the helicopter lift off the ground, Sarah realized there was no turning back now. The aircraft immediately began buffeting in the wind, requiring constant corrections to maintain control. Looking ahead, she could see the storm approaching like a solid wall of darkness. Behind her, Petty Officer Park was securing his rescue equipment and preparing for what they both knew would be an extremely challenging mission. He had worked with many pilots over the years, and he could sense the tension in the aircraft. This was going to test both of them in ways they had never experienced before. As they flew away from the relative safety of the base and headed toward the open ocean, Sarah couldn't shake Captain Hayes's words from her mind. You're not ready for this. Maybe he was right. Maybe no amount of training could prepare someone for what lay ahead. But, ready or not, 7 lives were depending on her ability to navigate through the storm and bring help to people who had nowhere else to turn. The helicopter pressed forward into the gathering darkness, its lights cutting through the rain as Sarah began what would become the most important flight of her career. 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah realized that everything she had learned about flying was about to be put to the ultimate test. The storm had intensified far beyond what the meteorologists had predicted. What should have been manageable conditions had transformed into a nightmare of wind, rain, and turbulence that threatened to tear the helicopter apart. The aircraft was being tossed around like a toy in a child's hands. One moment, they would be climbing rapidly as an updraft caught them. The next, they would be dropping so suddenly that Sarah's stomach felt like it was trying to escape through her throat. The rain was so heavy that the windshield wipers could barely keep up, creating a constantly shifting pattern of water that made navigation nearly impossible. Base operations, Rescue 6021, Sarah called into her radio, her voice strained as she fought to maintain control. Conditions are significantly worse than forecast. Requesting updated weather information. Static was the only response. They had lost radio contact with the base, just as predicted. Now they were truly on their own, flying blind through one of the worst storms Sarah had ever seen. The GPS was still functioning, showing they were roughly halfway to the Northern Star's last known position, but the winds were pushing them off course constantly. Petty Officer Park leaned forward from his position in the cabin. "Pilot, I'm seeing wind speeds of 65 knots on my instruments. This is getting into dangerous territory." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. She was using every ounce of her strength to keep the helicopter flying straight and level. The cyclic stick required constant pressure and adjustment, and her arms were already beginning to ache from the effort. Suddenly, a massive gust of wind caught the aircraft from the side, rolling them nearly 30 degrees to the left. Sarah reacted instinctively, applying opposite cyclic and adjusting the collective to level out, but not before several pieces of loose equipment crashed around the cabin. The helicopter shuddered and groaned under the stress, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah wondered if they had exceeded the aircraft's structural limits. "That was close," Park said, his usually calm voice betraying a hint of concern. "How much farther to the target?" Sarah checked her navigation display, squinting through the rain-streaked windscreen. 22 miles. "But, at this rate, it's going to take us another 25 minutes to get there, assuming we can maintain this heading." The reality of their situation was becoming increasingly clear. Not only were they flying through dangerous conditions, but they were also burning fuel at a much higher rate than normal due to the constant maneuvering required to fight the wind. Sarah did some quick calculations in her head and realized they were approaching the point of no return. Soon, they would have just enough fuel to make it back to base, with nothing left for the rescue operation. As if reading her thoughts, Park checked his own fuel calculations. "Pilot, we're going to be cutting this pretty close on fuel. Even if we find the Northern Star, we'll only have a few minutes over the target before we have to head home." Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew that a few minutes might be all they needed if everything went perfectly. The problem was that in conditions like these, nothing ever went perfectly. Rescue operations required time and precision, both of which were luxuries they couldn't afford. The helicopter lurched violently as another gust hit them, this time from below. Sarah felt her stomach drop as they were lifted suddenly, upward, then slammed back down by the turbulence. The artificial horizon on her instrument panel was spinning wildly, making it difficult to determine their actual attitude. She was flying almost entirely by feel now, using her instincts and training to keep them airborne. "There!" Park shouted suddenly, pointing through the windscreen. "I see lights. 2 o'clock, maybe 3 miles out." Sarah strained to see where he was pointing. At first, she saw nothing but rain and darkness. Then, for just a moment, the storm parted slightly, and she caught a glimpse of what looked like navigation lights bobbing up and down on the surface of the water. The Northern Star was still afloat, but barely. As they approached the fishing vessel, the true magnitude of the rescue challenge became apparent. The boat was listing heavily to one side, taking on water faster than the crew could pump it out. Huge waves, some 20 feet high or more, were crashing over the deck every few seconds. In these conditions, a normal rescue operation would be nearly impossible. Sarah brought the helicopter into a hover approximately 50 feet above the vessel. But maintaining position was like trying to balance on a tightrope during an earthquake. Every few seconds, the wind would push them off target, requiring immediate correction to avoid drifting into the boat's superstructure or being blown too far away to conduct the rescue. Through the rain and spray, Sarah could see figures on the deck of the Northern Star waving frantically. 7 people were huddled near the boat's stern, wearing orange life jackets, and clearly preparing to abandon ship. The vessel's captain was trying to maintain radio contact with them, but the storm was interfering with communications. Park was already preparing his rescue equipment, but he paused as he assessed the situation below. "Pilot, this is going to be extremely difficult. The boat is moving too much for a standard deck landing, and the water around them is too rough for a safe water pickup. We're going to have to do this by the book, one person at a time on the rescue basket." Sarah understood the implications. 7 people meant 7 separate rescue operations, each taking several minutes to complete safely. In these conditions, with their fuel situation, they simply didn't have time for a complete rescue of all 7 crew members. "How long do you estimate for each pickup?" she asked, her voice tight with concentration as she fought to hold position. "In these conditions, probably 4 to 5 minutes per person, minimum." Maybe longer if someone gets injured or panics. Sarah did the math quickly. 7 people at 5 minutes each would require 35 minutes, plus travel time back to shore. They had maybe 15 minutes of usable fuel remaining before they would have to abort the mission. The terrible reality was becoming clear. They could probably save 3, maybe 4 people before they would be forced to leave the others behind. The moral weight of this decision threatened to overwhelm her. How do you choose which lives to save and which to abandon? How do you look into the faces of desperate people and tell them that resources don't allow for their rescue? But before Sarah could fully process the implications of their situation, the fishing vessel's condition deteriorated dramatically. A massive wave, larger than any they had seen, crashed over the Northern Star's bow and rolled the entire boat nearly onto its side. When it righted itself, Sarah could see that the vessel was riding much lower in the water. They had minutes, not hours, before the boat went down completely. "Park, we need to move fast. That boat isn't going to stay afloat much longer." "Roger that. Deploying the rescue basket now." As Park began lowering the rescue equipment, Sarah realized that all of her training, all of her preparation, had led to this moment. The storm was testing every skill she possessed, pushing her aircraft and her abilities to their absolute limits. Captain Hayes had been right when he told her she wasn't ready for this. No one could ever be truly ready for conditions this extreme. But, ready or not, people were counting on her. The 7 crew members of the Northern Star were looking up at her helicopter as their only hope for survival. Their lives were quite literally in her hands, depending entirely on her ability to maintain control of the aircraft while Park conducted the rescue operation. As the first fisherman was secured in the rescue basket and began his ascent through the wind and rain, Sarah felt the full weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Every slight movement of the helicopter could mean the difference between life and death for the person dangling below them. One mistake, one moment of lost concentration, could result in tragedy. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse, as if nature itself was determined to prevent them from completing their mission. But Sarah gritted her teeth and held the helicopter steady, drawing on reserves of strength and determination she didn't know she possessed. This was what being a Coast Guard pilot really meant. It wasn't about perfect weather and routine training flights. It was about flying into impossible conditions because people's lives depended on it. It was about making the kind of decisions that would stay with you for the rest of your career, regardless of how they turned out. As the first rescued fisherman was pulled into the helicopter cabin, wet and shaking but alive, Sarah allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. 1 down, 6 to go. The question now was whether the Northern Star could stay afloat long enough for them to save everyone, and whether their fuel would last long enough to get everyone safely back to shore. The third rescue was in progress when everything started going wrong at once. Sarah had been maintaining her hover for nearly 15 minutes, fighting the storm's relentless assault on her helicopter while Park methodically pulled survivors from the sinking vessel. 2 fishermen were already secured in the cabin, wrapped in emergency blankets, and looking like they couldn't quite believe they were still alive. Then, the Northern Star lurched violently to starboard, her hull groaning audibly even over the storm's roar. Sarah watched in horror as the fishing vessel tilted at an impossible angle, water rushing across her deck and threatening to pull the remaining crew members into the churning sea. The boat was going down, and there were still 4 people aboard. "Park, we need to speed this up," Sarah shouted over the intercom. "She's not going to stay up much longer." "I know," Park replied, his voice strained as he worked to secure the 3rd survivor in the rescue basket. "But if we rush this, someone's going to get hurt or killed." Sarah felt her heart pounding as she watched the fuel gauge creep steadily toward the red zone. They were operating on borrowed time now, with barely enough fuel to make it back to shore even if they left immediately. Every minute they stayed meant risking not only the lives of the remaining fishermen, but also the lives of everyone already rescued, plus her and Park. The logical decision would be to leave with the 3 survivors they had already saved. 3 lives were better than none, and attempting to save the remaining 4 would likely result in everyone dying when the helicopter ran out of fuel over the open ocean. But As Sarah looked down at the desperate faces of the men still trapped on the sinking vessel, she knew she couldn't abandon them. Not when they were so close. A massive gust of wind suddenly slammed into the helicopter from the side, pushing them dangerously close to the Northern Star's radio mast. Sarah reacted instantly, pulling power and moving away from the vessel, but the sudden movement caused the rescue basket to swing wildly on its cable. The fisherman inside was thrown against the side of the basket, and, for a terrifying moment, it looked like he might fall out. "Steady, steady," Park called out, working frantically to control the basket's movement. "I've almost got him." Sarah gritted her teeth and fought to maintain position. Her arms were screaming with fatigue from the constant corrections required to keep the helicopter stable. Sweat was running down her face despite the cold air rushing through the aircraft, and her hands were cramping from gripping the controls so tightly. Finally, the third survivor was pulled into the cabin. 3 down, 4 to go. But, as Sarah glanced at the Northern Star, she could see that the vessel was settling much lower in the water. The remaining crew members were now standing in water up to their knees, and the boat's list had become so severe that it looked like she could capsize at any moment. "Park, how's our weight situation with 3 people aboard?" Sarah asked. "We're getting heavy, but still within operational limits. The real problem is going to be fuel. How much do we have left?" Sarah checked her gauges again and felt her stomach drop. "Maybe 10 minutes of flight time. Probably less with this headwind we'll be facing on the return trip." The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Even if they could rescue all 7 people in the next 5 minutes, which was impossible given the conditions, they would run out of fuel before reaching shore. But if they left now with 3 survivors, they would have to live with the knowledge that they had abandoned 4 people to die. As Sarah wrestled with this impossible decision, she noticed something that changed everything. The Northern Star's captain was waving frantically and pointing toward the stern of the vessel. Following his gesture, Sarah could see that the boat's life raft had broken free from its mounting and was drifting away from the ship. If the remaining crew members could reach the life raft, they might be able to survive until another rescue aircraft could reach them. "Park, do you see that life raft?" "Roger, I see it. It's drifting pretty fast, but it looks intact." Sarah made a split-second decision that would either save everyone or doom them all. Instead of continuing with the methodical basket rescues, she was going to attempt something she had never tried before, a mass rescue using the helicopter's cargo hook to lift the entire life raft with all 4 remaining crew members inside. It was an extremely dangerous maneuver that required perfect timing and precision flying. If she miscalculated even slightly, the raft could be destroyed by the helicopter's downwash, or the crew members could be thrown into the water. But it was the only way to save everyone with the fuel they had remaining. "Park, I'm going to try something. Get ready to deploy the cargo hook." "Pilot, what are you thinking?" "We're going to lift that life raft with everyone in it. It's risky, but it's the only chance we have to save them all." Park was quiet for a moment, understanding immediately what Sarah was proposing. It was the kind of desperate maneuver that was theoretically possible, but practically insane to attempt in these conditions. "All right," he finally said. "I'll get the hook ready. But we're only going to get one shot at this." Sarah maneuvered the helicopter toward the drifting life raft while simultaneously watching the Northern Star's crew members jump into the water and swim desperately toward their only hope of survival. The current was working against them, and the waves were so large that the swimmers kept disappearing from view between the swells. One by one, the fishermen reached the life raft and hauled themselves inside. Sarah could see them frantically signaling that they were ready, but the raft was being tossed around by the waves like a cork in a washing machine. Hooking onto it would require flying lower than she had ever flown in conditions this severe. "Hook is ready for deployment," Park reported. "But I need you to bring us down to about 30 feet and hold position directly over the raft." 30 feet above the water in these conditions was essentially suicide. The helicopter's rotor wash would create additional turbulence on the already chaotic sea surface, and any sudden downdraft could slam them into the water before Sarah could react. But looking at the fuel gauge, she knew they had no choice. Sarah began her descent, fighting every instinct that told her this was too dangerous. As they dropped closer to the water, the storm's full fury became apparent. Waves that had looked manageable from altitude now appeared massive and threatening. The helicopter was being buffeted so severely that Sarah could barely read her instruments. 20 feet. Park called out. I can see the raft clearly now, but it's moving too much for a safe hookup. Sarah had an idea. Using a technique she had practiced but never used in actual conditions, she began matching the life raft's movement with the helicopter's position. As the raft rode up on a wave, she climbed slightly. As it dropped into a trough, she descended. It was like an aerial dance with the ocean, requiring split-second timing and absolute precision. Now, Park shouted. Hook is going down. Sarah held the helicopter as steady as humanly possible while Park lowered the cargo hook toward the life raft. The 4 fishermen inside were doing their best to grab onto the hook and secure it to their raft's lifting points, but the constant movement made it nearly impossible. On the first attempt, the hook missed entirely as a wave lifted the raft just as it was about to make contact. On the second attempt, the fishermen managed to grab the hook, but couldn't secure it before another wave knocked it loose. Fuel warning light is on, Sarah announced, her voice tight with concentration. This has to be the last attempt. The third try was going to determine whether they saved everyone or lost everyone. Sarah brought the helicopter down to just 15 feet above the water, so close she could feel the spray hitting the windscreen. The rotor wash was creating its own weather system, but it also seemed to be pushing some of the waves down, creating a slightly calmer area around the life raft. Hook is going down again, Park called out. Come on, come on. This time, everything worked perfectly. The fishermen grabbed the hook and managed to secure it to the raft's lifting points just as a wave lifted them toward the helicopter. Sarah immediately began climbing, feeling the additional weight of the raft and its passengers dragging on the aircraft's performance. We've got them, Park shouted triumphantly. All 4 are secure in the raft. We can head home. But their troubles were far from over. The helicopter was now carrying 7 rescued crew members plus the additional weight of the life raft. The aircraft was heavy, sluggish, and burning fuel at an alarming rate. Sarah calculated their fuel consumption against the distance to shore and realized they were going to be cutting it extremely close. As they began their journey back to base, flying through the storm with their precious cargo, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. When Captain Hayes had told her she wasn't ready for this mission, he had been absolutely right. No amount of training could have prepared her for the decisions she had been forced to make or for the extreme conditions she had encountered. But sometimes being ready wasn't about having perfect preparation or ideal conditions. Sometimes being ready meant finding the courage to act when lives were at stake, even when you weren't sure you could succeed. It meant pushing beyond your known limits and discovering capabilities you didn't know you possessed. The helicopter emerged from the worst of the storm just as the fuel gauge reached its final red line. In the distance, Sarah could see the lights of the Coast Guard base, looking like a beacon of hope through the rain and darkness. They were going to make it, all of them, thanks to a combination of skill, determination, and probably a fair amount of luck. As they touched down safely on the base runway, emergency medical teams rushed to care for the rescued fishermen. Sarah shut down the helicopter's engines and sat quietly in the cockpit for a moment, letting the reality of what they had accomplished sink in. Captain Hayes approached the aircraft as Sarah was completing her post-flight inspection. His expression was unreadable as he looked at the 7 survivors being loaded into ambulances, then back at his young pilot. Martinez, he said finally, I owe you an apology. When I told you that you weren't ready for this, I was thinking about training and experience by the book. What I didn't account for was something that can't be taught or measured. What's that, sir? Heart. You had the heart to do whatever it took to save those people, even when the odds were against you. That's not something you can learn in a classroom or practice in a simulator. That's who you are as a person and as a pilot. Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she realized that she had not only survived her first major solo mission, but had exceeded every expectation anyone could have had. 7 people were alive because she had refused to give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. The storm had tested her in ways she had never imagined, pushing her skills and her aircraft to their absolute limits. But she had proven something important to herself. When it really mattered, when lives were hanging in the balance, she had what it took to get the job done. Years later, Sarah would go on to become one of the Coast Guard's most decorated rescue pilots, saving dozens of lives in conditions that other pilots considered impossible. But she would never forget that stormy night when a fishing vessel named Northern Star taught her that being ready for something isn't about perfect preparation. It's about finding the courage to act when action is needed, regardless of whether you feel prepared for what lies ahead.